But anyways, man, I mean, I'm really thank you so much for coming here and joining us for Left Reckoning 100. I was, it's this time of year, I think, when we're all sort of trying to plot out what's coming in front of us. And, I don't know if you know this, Bhaskar, but the first time my first day at TMBS was, I think it was like episode 3, episode 4, something like that. And you were on there. And I remember that because I didn't know where a studio was, and I knew you were going to be on there. And I sort of saw you going up the elevator. And I followed you up to find the studio. um, but I remember that episode very well, and I remember you talking with Michael about a point that I think was a really important one. And to be fair, I was a little annoyed with it when you made it at the time, but it was very prescient. I thought, which was that, like, if Bernie Sanders were to win, it would probably be a fairly disappointing experience because, like, we didn't have the apparatus and the structures that would probably be necessary to put in a lot of the things that we would want to do. And looking back at not just the fact that those elections weren't successful, but just seeing what the state of, like, the progressive left, or even more importantly to me, like the democratic socialist left is, I think that probably was what was coming if we were able to sort of pull it out at the end. And I know this is a broad question, but I mean, we had these two campaigns, 2016, 2020, that I think gave a lot of people on the left a lot of purpose right now. And since, I feel like folks have sort of scattered in a lot of different directions. And, as somebody who is as a publisher of, some great publications out there, I was just curious what your sense is of, like, what we have to be focusing on, where you think some of these important struggles and fights are going into 2023 and even more broadly in the next few years.
So the left, I think, is better off than it was like a decade ago in that it actually exists, which I
Yeah.
think is something that we shouldn't take for granted, because we had a time when the far left of America was like Jon Stewart, and maybe not Jon Stewart, maybe like Chris Hayes and some of our homies, Sam's friends from the America days. Where what passed for the American left, and
The
now
Nation too.
Yeah, I mean, The Nation was definitely a beacon.
Yeah.
At times, like I remember reading when I was in high school, The Nation for the Alexander Coburn columns, and
Yep.
everyone would have a favorite columnist or whatever else, but it was one of the few venues that actually gave the left a hearing. Now, of course, there's a lot of leftists around. Democratic Socialists of America is, roughly what, like 20 times bigger than it used to be, somewhere in that neighborhood. But I think that we're in pretty bad shape compared to where we were a couple years ago. And as testament to that, I would ask people whether they think in the popular imagination there's a distinct left-wing third kind of force in the United States. So it used to be that we kind of had our cake in 82. We had Bernie Sanders running in a Democratic Party primary, so we didn't have to waste our time building independent ballot lines and things like that. Yet we were still able to have an independent profile in American politics. So if someone asked you what's a Bernie-crat or what's a Bernie Democratic Socialist, they would have said wealth inequality, Medicare for all, hates millionaires and billionaires. There would have been a defined identity. Now I don't think there is much of a defined identity from a more amorphous progressivism within the Democratic Party. And I think a lot of what it means to be a radical or leftist is often defined by someone's position in the culture war. And whether you're scolding someone or whether you're unhappy about America, or whether you're quote unquote woke, I think that this is how people define what it is to be a leftist. And I think our elected officials like AOC and others haven't done a great job differentiating themselves from mainstream Democrats the way that Bernie for a time was able to do. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I'm not even sure that isn't necessarily even where it would lead. I'm not going down the path of the Jimmy Dorism, criticism, but I think it is true that the left, in my mind, is not as defined, and Medicare for all is a great litmus test for the health of the left, and it's totally off the agenda.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, yeah, not trying to get into the forced vote stuff again, but like for me, I felt like the railroad vote was much more of a defining moment than anything, and like not even like about like the strategy, because at this point, it's like you don't have the votes to stop what Joe Biden's trying to do, but like if the point of us having like DSA or Democratic Socialist politicians out there is to like sort of delineate between our politics and Democratic Party politics, I feel like that was a moment where it really wasn't on the national agenda or awareness. Like that, not only do we think that workers should be paid better, but like we think that it is like unjust for like the United States government to be able to dictate to workers what kind of conditions they have to accept.
Yeah, and I think that the reason why the squad did what they did with that vote was because they thought that pushing the paid sick days behind the scenes, and they listened to the union bureaucracy that basically told them to do that. So I think
Mhm.
that part of it is true,
Mhm.
but it's also that also tells you something about their strategy. A lot of
Right.
what they want to do is exert pressure behind the scenes. Whereas, like, obviously, the Freedom Caucus example is one that we can't overstate, because the left's tactics by nature, our strategy, is different than the right's because of our ideology. We believe in mass politics, we believe in the self emancipation of the working class, and you can't do that through a few parliamentary gains. And um, and I think this Polish Marxist, or he was a Marxist when he wrote this, Leszek Kolowski, once said that the left can have ideology, but the right is nothing but the accumulation of tactics.
Hmm.
And I think that's basically true. So I'm not saying that there was an easy route to do a kind of a Freedom Caucus holding the House hostage. But I think that the fact that the squad, even if it had the leverage, we can't imagine them doing it, I think is a bad sign, if only because our goal, I think, is to create this third front in American politics and to propagandize and organize in a mass way, in a very different way than Congress, for an egalitarian agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I watched AOC on like day 4 of the McCarthy stuff talk about the strategy, and she mentioned one thing which I thought was kind of, I think it was interesting overall, and she's I think better at communicating than some people on the left give her credit for. But there's one thing she said about the committees, which is like when you start to leapfrog people on committee assignments, you start upsetting the party structure. It's like that needs to happen though. Like we need to be leapfrogging committee seats, and to the extent, if that can't be happening, that needs to be like elaborated, I think. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Bernie has more power. He's a junior senator from Vermont. He has more power than the senior senator from Vermont, because he used his leverage to leapfrog, in the Senate. I mean, so
Yeah.
I think that I think a lot of it is personalized through AOC, for better or worse, but that's because when the left doesn't have a mass force, we become focused too much on our handful of politicians, and also our media outlets.
Mhm.
But again, I do think there's a degree of complacency that comes from having won some gains and then just saying, all right, we're going to consolidate. That's fine. A lot of the Trotskyists left that I was once more sympathetic to, and I still have some sympathies for too, um, often talk about union bureaucracies and party bureaucracies like they're by nature evil, whereas like at some point you need to consolidate gains, you need to pause in advance and figure out what you're going to do next. But I think all we basically have to have shown from the last few years is a few more elected officials and the Democratic Party moving a little bit to the left on a few issues. But our core message is a radical egalitarian one, that the US order is fundamentally unjust, right? That there's millions of people who aren't getting their fair share, and there's tens of thousands of people leeching off them. And we need a very different economic order, and we need a set of basic social protections that include state-run healthcare and a host of other demands. Those are just the immediate steps that Bernie laid out very clearly. in 2016, a little bit less clearly in 2020, but it was still there. And I just feel like that clarity is gone. And even if you go to, the DSA join site and you read like the messaging, you're like, wow, we've lost the Bernie messaging. Whereas the Bernie messaging wasn't the problem. We maybe needed some more organizing and more militancy around
Mhm.
carrying out the agenda. But it seems like we not only have lost what was useful, like the mainstream, but still radical messaging, but we're combining it with a set of tactics that won't even get things done.
This is like the thing, and like this is the kind of conversation that's not very good for like YouTube stuff because it's not like point scoring. But you're talking about mass politics earlier, and like for me, what frustrates me so much about the moment that we're in, the state that I think the left or the socialist left is in this country, is that like just again using the force of the vote thing as an example, right? Not even talking about the merits of the strategy. I didn't think it was the best strategy. I'm not against militancy from elected officials, but it didn't really make a lot of sense to me, particularly because if what we're doing right now is if like let's say we have like this strategy, this thing that could sort of open up the door to open up a Medicare for all in this country, which is something that we desperately need, and the vehicle that we're using for that is like public media pressure campaigns on like a couple elected officials to hope that they go with us, I think we sort of lost the plot at that point. You know what I mean? Like you have to have like some kind of mass structure organization beforehand. You can't just sort of build that up in these kind of parliamentary moments where there's some kind of tactical opening to maybe do something or not. And what's been so frustrating for me, especially like the couple years past the Bernie loss in 2020, is that there hasn't been that much of like a real reckoning or thinking about how to build that. Instead, like I mean, like the hegemonic like culture that we're in is very individualistic, and what's I feel like has happened more often than not is like people have sort of crystallized their like left wing identity and like whatever perspective it is that they have versus thinking about how to be building a mass movement that in moments like this could actually have some kind of political effect in politics.
So the one kind of counter I would give you to one of your examples is Occupy itself, which emerged because of a bizarre call in Adbusters and
Mm-hmm.
tactics that were just these ultra leftist tactics of occupation that really got their trial in the U.S. at like the UC system occupations and a few other occupations, like the New School occupation. At the time, I thought was like useless to say the least,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, then it became something. So at a moment where there is no mass activity, where politics is at a low, do we I think this is the moment where we need more voluntarism, not less. And I want to put force of vote aside because it was
Yeah.
particularly unusual the way it was used and the way it was harnessed to kind of build certain brands in a certain style that I thought was like very counterproductive. But that aside, I do think that it would be useful. I don't think there's anything to lose by kind of putting our chips in and failing. Maybe we just need to pick our spots or pick the campaign, but more activity is a good thing. And for me, I thought there was a moment where maybe it could come from a labor populism, kind of out of the Starbucks and Amazon workers
Mm-hmm.
campaigns and other efforts to link labor solidarity in with just a message of equality and economic equality that ordinary, particularly younger working class people can tie themselves into, whether they're at Starbucks or Amazon or just like at a similar part of the labor market. And I still think something like that will emerge, but we have to be willing to take advantage of those opportunities when they arise.
Yeah, do you think they arise on the federal level? Do you think there's any possibility, like, I mean, just like thinking in New York State here, we had Hochul just on one with like insane priorities, and we do have a DSA contingent. Like, do you think like the state level is any more um, fruitful for possibly creating this sort of identity?
It has to be national just because When you're like politics all around the world, but particularly in the US, that has such a hollowed out party structure
Mhm.
and has such a hollowed out left, is happening at the national level and through mass media and communications. And I'm not a populist in theory, in that, I'm a fairly orthodox Marxist in theory, but tactically, I think that taking advantage of a big national us versus them discourse and trying to, maybe it'll take root in one state, but I would compare, I think about how radical Wisconsin was in terms of like the occupation and
Mm.
the how connected it was with labor. Um, it really was on a massive scale for Wisconsin. Like if Wisconsin was a country, then like the whole country was in a level of real turmoil and politicization, and became like the topic that everyone across the state was talking about. But that had very little ripple effects throughout the country. Whereas Occupy, the Bernie campaigns, Black Lives Matter, these are things that were national to some degree. You could say that Occupy and BLM were, to begin with, largely media events that turned into something more substantial after. They
Mhm.
weren't social movements in the way that real organic mass social movements like the farmers movement in India or the landless workers movement in Brazil, you could really say, had these deep, really just mass on a scale we can't even comprehend in the US. So yeah, I think it has to happen nationally. I think elections are a great way, and candidate like Bernie campaign was a great way to put certain issues on the agenda. The next step is obviously we need to tie that to organization, but but why not keep trying to replicate certain parts of the Bernie campaign while we're building more organizations? And the last thing I'll say is that DSA is a socialist organization that was basically built out of the Bernie moment to 100,000
Mhm.
members. Now, maybe the next step is for the next upsurge to build a broader organization that is a class based organization that's built around left populist rhetoric and the demands of economic redistribution, that, of course, would need to be tied in with socialists, and socialists would need to be at the forefront of, but might take the version of an American Podemos instead of just a more narrow, ideological, and by nature somewhat sectarian. And I say this as a DSA member since literally age 17 organization.